Hello everyone, hope you're all having a good time in this course and in your other courses. In this week's module we're going to introduce the concept of looking at assessment and grading and trying to figure out if there are any differences and how we would use assessment data to try and assign a grade. Now this gets into some quite controversial topics because if you speak to health and physical education teachers and you ask them what do you use, what elements do you look at when you're assigning students grades, you're going to get lots of different answers, and it's based upon people's philosophies and a lot of the different answers, and people will get pretty vocal and you know, they'll defend their position in terms of how they assign grades and that they think it's the right thing to do. So we'll begin to look at this. It won't be the only time in this course that we talk about assessment and the relationship to grading, but I did want to introduce it early on to try and you know, so we can start thinking about this stuff now. There are two readings associated with this lecture, 2 articles and a chapter. I would encourage you to look at those and then reflect on the readings, and then we'll go from there. This is a fairly short module, and I'm only asking you to do 2 reflections. It's a short lecture, so this is a 1-week module. So the article reflections will be due this coming weekend. Okay, so as we begin this, maybe you can, in your mind, start to think about your philosophy on grading. I know some of you are teaching right now and assigning grades, and some of you aren't. But just think about it for yourself. Pretend you're about to start a 9-week grading period, and that you have to assign grades at the end of that 9 weeks. What elements are you going to include when calculating grades? Will you give certain percentages for certain elements and other percentages for other elements? And how are you going to break those down, and how are you going to defend it when students might ask you, how come I got this grade and not a better grade? So let me switch to slideshow mode here. Oh, I'm not sure that's going to do much. Let me go up here. Okay, so hopefully you can see this okay still. So the big question is, what is the difference in assessment and grading? And is there a difference? I would like to tell you that I think there is, and we'll move to answer this question as we go through this lecture. We do know that grades are intended for certain things. We assign students grades so we can communicate with them how they are doing in our classes. The grades serve as a motivator for the future. They allow us to inform parents of how their students, how their children are doing. And it also provides a yardstick for administration to examine program effectiveness. So we can use grades to see what percentage of students are meeting certain student learning outcomes at what level. And then our administrators could use this to say whether the program's being effective or not. Now that can be dangerous because there's lots of other variables that could affect student learning and student performance, and a lot of those variables are out of the control of the teacher. So grading, here's a quote that I like: grades must be based on learning outcomes and performance that demonstrates those learning outcomes. And grading can help us as teachers. It allows us to show that we're achieving our goals as a teacher, that we must be planning good lessons and we're being effective teachers if the grading shows that the students are meeting those learning outcomes and performance outcomes. Grading can also help us by demonstrating the importance and effectiveness of our program. So we can provide data on advocacy issues to show the importance of our program to parents and administrators. So my personal feelings on grading in physical education, I think it's hard. I think it's really hard to do. And I think one of the reasons that we've had so much controversy and so much reluctance to change traditional grading practices is that it is really hard to do. Whereas most core subject areas only deal with grading in the cognitive domain, which is pretty easy to do. It's just tests and quizzes. In our field, we have to assess and grade in 3 areas, which is the psychomotor, motor skill, performance, physical activity, fitness, the cognitive domain, and also the affective domain. All 3 of those are important, as we discussed last week in our field of physical education. So that makes it trickier than most subject areas, where you can just throw out a few quizzes and multiple choice tests, and that allows us to assign a grade because it's all based on that cognitive knowledge. However, we can't do that in our field. We don't have these big standardized tests that we can use to as an assessment and in grading. We've had some issues in our field, and I really want you to think hard about this, because you may have some opinions on this, and if you do, that's okay. I just want you to really think critically to be able to defend your opinion. We know that traditional grading in physical education includes a big percentage of their grade for whether they dress out, whether they participate, and the amount of effort they expend in their classes. Now, if we go back to the last slide or the slide before, where it says that grades should be related to the performance on stated student learning outcomes and learning, I'm not sure that those 3 things on this slide actually are a measure of student learning. The equivalent would be for a math teacher to give a student an A on a test if the student just tried, or if they brought their materials that they need for math, even though the student made a 60 on the math test. So we need to think about dressing out, participation, and effort, whether we should even be using those as part of our grading plan. And if we do, definitely shouldn't be using it as any kind of significant percentage. So here's an example of a traditional grading policy, and we're going to come back to this as you get to design your own grading policies. But in this example, for 100% of the grade, 40% of it was allocated to attendance and dress, 30% to effort, attitude, participation, 10% to some kind of cognitive written test, and 20% to some kind of psychomotor skills test. Now, if you look at this, you probably are quite familiar with this approach. It may be what you experienced in your classes. And I'm here to tell you that according to the literature coming out of our field, this isn't a best practice. And it's this kind of grading policy that's led, one of the main factors that's led to our field not being that well respected. No other subject area would give up to 70% of the grade just for attendance and attitude. Think about that. Okay, obviously we want students to have good dressing out and good attendance and good attitudes, but giving them a massive percentage of their grade for those things just doesn't make sense when we want students to learn in our classes. When we look at some general assessment categories, we sometimes break it down into formal and informal assessment. Formal assessments are usually standardized and controlled and can include things such as skills tests, where each kid waits for a chance to perform a skill, some kind of written test, performance records, maybe a video analysis of motor performance, and then any kind of fitness test, which the most popular right now is the fitnessgram. So those are very formal, very controlled. Hopefully the test for one kid or the test conditions are the same for any other kid in that class. Informal assessments are less structured, and they're integrated into the learning process to promote growth. These are also known as alternative assessments or authentic assessments. Okay, so we got kind of traditional versus authentic is the same thing as formal versus informal. Some examples here are rating scales, performance descriptions, journals, skill completion checklists, interviews, peer checklists, and there's lots of other types of assessments that fall into that authentic category that we'll look at again later in this course. Two other categories that are important that I think we've already introduced. One is called formative assessment. In formative assessment, the purpose is to provide continuous, ongoing feedback to both students and the teacher about progress towards the learning goals. So this is done throughout the unit or the learning experience, as opposed to summative assessment, which usually occurs at the end of the instruction and is intended to provide a formal and final evaluation of student performance and or learning for grading purposes. So when we talk about the new physical education, we know that learning and grading should be based on actual student learning. In all of the documents coming out of our national organizations and all the latest articles in our professional journals, they talk about that grading should be based on student learning and that you've got to try and measure student learning as opposed to talking about participation, dressing out, effort, and attendance. Those are very subjective concepts, and we know that some of them have nothing to do with actual student learning. And like I said a couple of slides ago, it's this approach to grading that has led to our programs not being incredibly well respected. So the best teachers out there have these really good assessment programs where they're measuring student learning and using that as part of the grading plan. Your school philosophy and program goals would determine grading. They should be based on the NASP standards, and there's 5 of those, and we'll see those in another class, along with the state standards, which in North Carolina we know are called the state essential standards. And some of you won't be familiar with what the essential standards are, so that's something else, again, we'll have to revisit in another class. So we know that if we want students to be competent in physical activities, then they must be held accountable for that achievement, and that should be the focus of the grading. So one of the assignments you'll do later in this course is to design your own grading policy. And I want to mention that now, even though I'm not asking you to do anything on that now. But I really want you to think about what is it you want your students to learn in your classes, and how those relate to the NASP and then the state essential standards, and what assessments you will use for grading purposes. So what we'll have to do is, as we move through, we'll talk about different assessments that you may or may not use for part of that plan. So what I would like you to do is read the articles in this module. I think they're fascinating. I think they're really interesting, and this module, like some of the others, the real learning is not going to come from you listening to me talking on top of a PowerPoint. The real learning for you in this and some other modules is going to come from reading these articles in the chapter and really thinking about it. Okay, now I know that some of you might just skim the articles as opposed to really reading it, but if you're serious about getting something out of this course and writing a good reflection, and I should be able to tell from the reflections whether you've read and thought critically about these assignments, I'm hoping you do that. So read the articles in the module. It gives some great ideas on how to grade. If they didn't, I wouldn't have assigned those articles. They're there for a reason. I don't just throw articles up on Blackboard to create busy work for you. And then later on in the course, you're going to need this information to develop your grading policy. And, you know, obviously, as a hint, when we come back to this, when we cycle back round and we put all these modules together and you design your grading policy, if I did see any grades given for effort or dressing out attendance, that's not going to be good, because this whole lecture and these articles are talking about why we need to be moving away from that kind of grading policy. Okay, so that concludes the short lecture for the second module. Go ahead and read those articles and look through the chapter. You don't have to read the chapter as closely as the articles, but I put it there as a resource for you. But go ahead and read those articles, write a good reflection. I was very pleased with the reflections from last week. Try to be detailed and specific in your thoughts, and then maybe we'll do a follow-up on some of those articles. Okay? Contact me if you have any questions.